At this time, I would like to introduce Daniel Pierce Bergen, who is a Minnesota native and is the director and producer of Jim Crow of the North. Bergen is one of those rare people who knew from the age of 10 that he wanted to be making films and making them about the people in the Twin Cities. After he graduated from the University of Minnesota, Bergen began his longstanding relationship with TPT as a production assistant in the community affairs, but quickly climbed the ranks and made an impact. One of his more celebrated early pieces was a 2004 documentary on the North Star, Minnesota's Black Pioneers, which was work that put the spotlight on some often overlooked figures in Minnesota history. And his Minnesota Experience series, which is part of the TPT programming, launched 2018 and is dedicated solely to airing documentaries about the way we as Minnesotans have lived. Jim Crow of the North was actually just the second installment in that group and premiered a year ago in February of 2019. Amazing. Stay power, Daniel. But many of the documentaries within this series masterfully highlight issues of race in Minnesota. And one of his current documentaries on sports history in Minnesota does a beautiful job of telling the history of women in sports, minorities in sports, all kind of centered around the year, is it 1965, 66?
1960, Michelle, the pivotal year in sports in Minnesota.
Thank you. 1960. I am just so impressed. I am not a sports fan, but the introduction and the full range of storytelling that Daniel does is what really just drew me to that documentary in particular. So I thank you so much for being here. We are just honored to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Hello, everybody.
And at this time, I'd like to introduce Bukata Hayes, the Executive Director of the Greater Mankato Diversity Council. He's worked tirelessly for many years to promote equality and racial justice in the Mankato community through mutual respect and civility. Some of the initiatives of the Greater Mankato Diversity Council include promoting respect workshops in the schools, the Perspectives business curriculum, and the Right on Race community journaling initiative. I am especially proud that Bukata has worked with us at Centenary on an event about a year ago. Bukata and Pastor Erica Kozer co-hosted a showing of the documentary 13 about mass incarceration of Black men in the United States. I know from my own personal experience that that event that we held had a significant positive effect on the community here. So Bukata, I am glad you're here for this event as well. Welcome.
Thank you, Lou. Appreciate being here with everyone in the community to engage in this dialogue.
Daniel, would you like to take a few minutes to speak for yourself, maybe introduce yourself, or maybe share with us a little bit your thoughts on this to get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for doing this. This is really meaningful to myself and my team at TPT and the Mapping Prejudice team and everyone involved in creating Jim Crow of the North. It really is the aspiration for the work we do, is that we create stories that go beyond broadcast and that it really has relevance and meaning in the community. So this is huge, and it really is meaningful to me to come into, with our broadcast, we're coming into your living rooms, and now I feel like I'm coming into your living rooms through Zoom. So it's great to see all these great faces. And thanks for that wonderful introduction, Michelle. You know, the one little nuance I would offer is, while you're right, as a Minneapolitan born and raised, I'm fascinated, and it feels part of my job to lift up voices of the Twin Cities and of the less heard stories of the Twin Cities, but also of Minnesota. I noticed in the chat someone from Northfield was in the mix, and maybe there are others beyond Mankato, and I love that. I'm glad you mentioned the sports documentary. I think my favorite story, while I love Dorothy McIntyre, the great pioneer of girls and women's sports advocacy, some of you may remember, you may be old enough to remember the 1960 state basketball championship and the Edgerton Flying Dutchman. And to be able to interview one of those players here 60 years later, well, it was 59, we interviewed him last year, but what a great story to tell. You know, the power of coming together around sports. It was a fun one to share about kind of small town Minnesota when the whole state was watching tiny Edgerton knock off a big metro team in Richfield. But that documentary, as you mentioned, also, as I hope we always do, considered other voices and what, you know, the historians call absent narratives. You know, what are the stories that we aren't hearing, and many of us who grew up in Minnesota simply didn't learn about beyond a cursory mention in the textbooks and in the lectures of our classroom. So that's really central to my work with Twin Cities PBS. Like a lot of you, I feel like, while current affairs, news, these are crucial, and having, you know, really accountable, fair, accurate media is essential to our democracy. There's something unique about history, I think, that allows us to, one, to kind of understand how we got to now and really look at the roots of, in this case, some of the worst in the nation disparities. But also, I think history offers a common ground sometimes that maybe political issues of the day aren't as inclusive or maybe welcoming for us to kind of see ourselves, find universal truths, but still deal with the hard truths. You know, I'm coming to you from South Minneapolis in my home, and I hope this doesn't come off as odd or ghoulish, but this is a piece of a structure from Lake Street. I grew up just 3 blocks south of Lake Street, 2 blocks from Chicago Avenue. So where George Floyd was murdered is my neighborhood, and all the kind of conflicting emotions that I felt in seeing that, and then all that followed. And this is just a weird thing I have with collecting little pieces of history. I've got a little bit of the mortar from Central High in Little Rock, the historic Central High. Historians say don't do that, it's probably the wrong thing to do, but more importantly, with storytelling, we can preserve history, and we can share history and have touchstones that aren't literally something you can touch to better understand our past. And that was the idea behind Jim Crow of the North. Was my friends, led by Kirsten Delegard, were doing this cutting edge research that I was aware of. And I thought it would be a really important way, while difficult in terms of cinema and storytelling, but an important way for all of us to have a better understanding of what the headlines were telling us about just how bad the disparities were in Minnesota. And we can talk about it more, but I'm sure, like a lot of you, one of the things I found compelling about their research and wanted to use in the storytelling so that we can have conversations that move these issues forward is some of the irrefutable data, you know, the power of facts and the concrete primary source that are the deeds and the racist covenants therein. I thought was a really good way to move beyond, you know, even the importance of personal narrative, but to really say, this is real, read the language, and here's what it led to. You know, so when you hear lines like Kevin Erwin Solberg say, you know, that the FHA used restrictive covenants as a way to create the maps that would become red lines, it's clear and it's irrefutable. And then we can move on from there and say, this happened, systemic racism is real, now what? So, and then with that, and then I'll wrap up, you know, the idea of, unlike their research, I wanted to weave in some strength-based stories. It's important to me to not just focus on the struggles and the pathology, really, and that, you know, while it's important to know the disparities, I wanted to also acknowledge the strength and the resilience and the resistance of, in this case, the African-American community that still in my native South Minneapolis managed to thrive in spite of all that red line neighborhood or the lack of access to the green line neighborhoods kind of set upon them. So I look forward to chatting with you all more, and I'm really excited, Bukata, to hear more about what you all are doing down in Mankato.
All right, so thank you, Daniel, and I think it's okay for me to go now, right, Lou and Michelle? So,
Yes.
one, I want to say thank you to everyone who is on the Zoom call with us. I think this is just a critically important topic. If we understand housing, we understand its impacts to economics, to education, to criminal justice, like this entire system in which we walk through our daily lives. And so I think about the importance of Jim Crow of the North to highlight these ways in which that existence was barred for certain folks. Like this idea of being able to get a house and understands what that means for leaving something for the folks who are coming after you, what that means for funding schools, what that means for safety and security. I think it's important that we speak to that. And in preparing for tonight, I went back and viewed the film, and then also and in viewing the film, I thought about one thing, and I thought about through the documentary, it shows these ways in which like an entire system like was built to keep you out. So I thought about the community members who felt it appropriate to simply be outside your house and to terrorize you for being in your space that you paid your money for. I thought about the audacity to say, hey, we're going to buy you out of your property, right? We're just going to give you some money so you can go, and we're going to consider it even. I think about the courts, right? As Daniel and his team just plainly stated, the Supreme Court upheld racialized covenants. And so this idea of the courts, the realtors, the police, like all these ways in which, and I think about the suffocating nature of systemic racism and white supremacy, and that it is in the narrative, it is in behavior, it is in systems and structures, and all of those systems and structures were weaponized, right, against African Americans who were and people of color who were looking simply to do what we would all hope to do, and that is plant our roots, like grow our tree, and make sure that that tree is ready for folks who come after that. And so I thought about another documentary, just one data point around the redlining, and that was in Race the Power of Illusion, the third episode about the house we live in. And they talk about that 239 cities across the country, right, were kind of assessed for financial risk. And in Jim Crow of the North, it talked to it. And actually, what I found great about the documentary was that Jim Crow of the North talked about how in Minneapolis it started in 1910. And in the house we live in, they talk about the FHA starting in 1930. So in some ways, like we were ahead of the curve of excluding folks, right? Like we talk about Minnesota as like we the Minnesota miracle and what we do and how we move, and in essence, right, that piece of history shows that we were ahead of the trend, right, ahead of the curve in terms of using racialized covenants. But a data point I'll mention again because it speaks to the economics. I went and researched what is today the top 200 cities in our country, and like in terms of population, you get down to about 140,000, right? So I want us to think about, like, if you assess 239 cities across our country, right, where could you go as an African-American family seeking like this economic foundation that was built on equity and equality? You couldn't. Like, I mean, you were forced to be in certain spaces, and then how we subsidize folks to be in those spaces. the data point I use says $120 billion between 1934 and 1962 went to basically new home growth within our country. And only 2% of that 120 billion went to folks who were non-white. And so again, this notion of all of these things, the suffocating nature, right, and system and structure that was in place, that I am just grateful that Daniel and his team was able to highlight a piece of that with us in our state. And then now, as we think about sitting post George Floyd's murder, how I think it is incumbent upon us, and I've been saying this, and folks who have heard me speak may have heard this, I think we are duty bound as Minnesotans to play our part. I don't believe we have an option, right? As we sit as the epicenter of like this global protest around examining ourselves and our systems, I think Jim Crow of the North further solidifies that point that we have to do our own work here. And so I'm just really appreciative of this conversation. Daniel, I appreciate and applaud your work, brother. I really do. I can't wait to see the sports film too. I'm a sports guy, so I'm looking forward to that. But I think this conversation is needed. I think it speaks to many things, many honest conversations we have to have going forward to do this work.
Okay, and questions have started to come in, so I'll just throw the first one out. Is this discussion tonight somehow coming from a focus of the Christian religion? Daniel, you want to take it first, and then Bukata?
Well, you know, what I'll add, and I'd love to hear from some of the faith leaders in the conversation as well, is that, you know, certainly the history, and I think anyone who knows anything about this history of the civil rights movement knows that it was seated in the Christian faith, in the Black churches of the South primarily, and the North, and that the mass meetings and the move and the movement all streamed out of faith communities. So that is an appropriate framing, certainly with some of the work that you all are doing in your faith community. I think that is key to making change. Certainly that's how we've seen it happen in the past. And, you know, take it from me in terms of the conversations that I've been in around Jim Crow of the North, and it's included being in the belly of the beast of like Wells Fargo and US Bank. And it's cool that they wanted to kind of process this as well. You know, housing and urban development here in Minneapolis, they realized they're the guardians of the Fair Housing Act, and they didn't know a lot of this history. But the many conversations that we've had with folks like you all here in the cities and in the suburbs, Black churches and all white faith communities, it's clearly a place where folks like you are willing to kind of have these conversations. So that's my response to that kind of an interesting and important question.
You know, I think I will respond in one way. I think I would, and I don't know this for certain, but I am pretty sure that many of the folks who engaged in the behavior that we saw in the film, who were part of a system that barred folks from being part of home ownership, were also folks of faith. And I think in knowing that, I think, again, we have to step up to the plate if we're folks of faith, because we believe as folks of faith in the concept and notion of repentance, right? And repentance means we get honest with ourselves. We look in the mirror. We look at all the blemishes. We look at where we are falling short, and then we commit to do better. And we try and change. It's a behavioral thing. And so I think for me, to the question of like Jim Crow of the North, what we've seen, and for us as folks of faith, I would say it aligns really well, actually, right, with what we are, who we are supposed to be in moments of trial and tribulation, in terms of seeing what it is for what it is, and then behaving accordingly in the tradition of repentance plays really well in us having this conversation tonight, and then us doing work going forward.
We have one technical question now that we should get out of the way. So one of the viewers ask if there is a recording being made of this event. And yes, there is. And Wilbur, correct me if I'm wrong, but it can be accessed from our Facebook page.
Yes, and we'll have that posted also at Centenary United Methodist Church website as well.
Okay.
It'll be on our YouTube page.
At our YouTube page.
On our YouTube page.
Another question, were there racial covenants in outstate Minnesota? And I'm not sure if Mankato was included in outstate or not, but just, so I would say that means other than the Twin Cities.
Yeah,
So-
I know Ricardo has some insights on that. If I could just start, I wanted to share just a quick reminiscence. And those of you who saw Kirsten Delegard and I present at the Y last year may recall this, but that day or that week, my sister-in-law is from Mankato, and she sent me an email and said, hey, my mom saw this, she's hoping to come. And then she said in an email, she told me that our house, built in 1959, had a similar covenant, whereas no people of color could own a house on Summer Hill. I don't know that neighborhood. She told me their attorney had highlighted it when they went over the documents before my parents bought the house. My mom remembers him saying that it has an expiration date, which they don't, and they shouldn't worry about it, but he made them aware of it. So, that's anecdotal, but it's pretty valid. As the Mapping Prejudice team continues their work, they hope to continue to journey, across the state and the nation. But yeah, you all, after that screening, were one of the first communities to really respond to that call.
And I would answer that question, as Daniel said. We have documented evidence of racialized covenants in Mankato. One of the reasons why Blue Earth County and the city of Mankato, the Diversity Council, YDUB, was looking at bringing Mapping Prejudice here was to see really how much more, right? We found in the Hillcrest neighborhood and some other places where it said this parcel of land can only be sold to folks of the Caucasian race only, right? So in terms of outstate, in terms of outside of the Twin Cities, absolutely. And there was, and so I think important with that though is, and they talked about it in the documentary about this de jure, if you will, kind of covenants, but then the de facto racial lines of communities that were built as well, where you knew not to kind of cross this particular road or go into this particular neighborhood. And I think that's part of what we have to reckon with as well. If we think about the documentation of sundown towns, right? Sundown towns for folks of color, you knew this is a place you didn't want to be. If you've ever seen the movie Green Book, you know that there was a book that folks had that said, hey, here's where you go and here's where you don't go. So while we may not have had this abundance of racialized covenants and it played out the same way it played out in Minneapolis, we did have racialized covenants, and we also had sort of this behavior in which we also kept folks of color out of kind of outstate communities throughout this state, but also throughout the home state of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I mean, my home state of Wisconsin.
Okay. Next question should go to you first, Bukata. And then Daniel. Is this information about covenants and redlining being taught in middle and high schools? I never learned this information when I was in school, is the comment.
So I couldn't speak to what the curriculum is teaching in our Mankato area public schools. I can tell you I did learn about it in my kind of K through 12 education in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Actually didn't learn about it truthfully probably until I got to college or maybe even post-college. So I at least from my experience, I would say it is not being taught within the schools in being taught as an intentional measure. I think that's the other thing that we have to come to grips with, is that there was intentionality behind these covenants. It wasn't kind of haphazard, and in some places, like it was entire plots of land that these covenants appeared. And so I don't believe it's being taught as this intentional measure that we use to exclude folks. And again, I'm only speaking from my education. My son, who is now a junior in college, went through the Mankato Area Public Schools. I don't remember him and I having a conversation about him learning this throughout his schooling. I have two more, a freshman and a sophomore now. I haven't heard them talking about this being taught in school as well. And so I don't believe it's being taught in curriculum within our public schooling system.
Right. I mean, the good news is, and this is one of the great powers of media, while I'm one to say the book is always better, you know, the adaptation of the film, they're all great, the book is better. And, you know, that extends, I think, certainly to documentary work, and that I'd rather folks really do go dive deep and read Slavery by Another Name, and we produced the documentary with that, and they would have even better understanding of 13. So the good news is the awareness that the documentary has raised, along with all the great work that Mapping Prejudice has done, has brought it to the attention of educators who have started to develop their own curriculum, sometimes on a school by school, classroom by classroom basis. And Kirsten from Mapping Prejudice and I have started to see and hear from some educators at as early as middle school, and then all the way into college and high level work, where they are now starting to kind of work this into the curriculum. And you can see why. I mean, it certainly is history, but it also is played out. My daughter had the advanced placement human geography class here at Washburn High School in Minneapolis. And so that kind of higher level human geography, this is a really good kind of subject matter for them to understand that intersection of place and people and policy and the impact. And I've seen some really cool nuances on the history, and Adopt a Neighborhood curriculum that a teacher in Anoka has done, where it focuses on urban neighborhoods in Minneapolis and tries to kind of connect through study and research and maybe develop that empathy with this idea of understanding some of the neighborhoods that were affected. You know, I think for some time, redlining has been a little more familiar and does find its way into history, again, on a real surface level. That's really all I had until I actually moved in this neighborhood in South Minneapolis and did become aware of covenants that some of my neighbors, my white neighbors, said, guess what, our house has these things called restrictive covenants. This is a decade ago. So, you know, there was some familiarity, but another reason why it probably hasn't made it into education is because it's complicated and it's buried deep in the documents. And so that's what's wonderful about Mapping Prejudice, is surfacing it and making it accessible, literally going to their webpage and being able to certainly help them review the deeds, but also use that resource. I think we're going to see it continue to spread into classrooms.
Okay, and now we have a question that I think is really interesting. Now there's a lot of talk about the damage done by gentrification in traditional Black neighborhoods. How does that play into the existing wealth gap, and how can we do better? And Daniel, why don't you go first, and then Bukata.
Yeah, that certainly is the discussion here on the South Side. You know, we're seeing that, you know, and it's a broad term, but we are seeing some demographic changes, some increase in housing, the pressurized housing market, certainly of the city of Minneapolis. So it's a legitimate concern. You know, on the policy side, there's the city of Minneapolis, you probably have heard and read about the 2040 plan, and that's complicated, and it's, you know, meant to address some of the concerns, the need for density and some other things. But I think a story, a cogent example of the balance is in our neighborhood, again, on historic 38th Street. So Chicago and 38th is where George Floyd was murdered. And then if you head west, you head into 4th Avenue, which is the historic Black neighborhood on the South Side. But you know, on 38th, in that neighborhood, there's a co-op, Seward Co-op, some of you may be familiar with, one of the first in the nation. They opened a second store a few years ago in the heart of the historic Black community. And so the good news is there was conversation at the onset because of resistance coming out of, check it out, the church, the Black churches saying, hold up, Seward, you're great and everything, and we get your radical roots, but what's this gonna mean to us? Can we work there? Can we afford to shop there? you're taking literally one of our churches to do it. It was the old Sabathani Friendship Church on 38th. And so there was a process. And again, it's complicated and it was troubled, but in a good way. And now Seward stands as the Friendship Store, named after the church, with a plaque from the church in its wall, but also, to my eye as a member, with a lot of Black folks and people of color working there. So that's just one story. There's still a lot to do and a long way to go in this neighborhood as it relates to gentrification, but it's a real issue that's overgeneralized by that one word, but is a good clarion for all of us to know that there's a tension, there's a problem with housing and affordability and place and power and people in neighborhoods.
Bukata?
You know, I don't have much to add. I think Daniel covered it fantastically. I would just say I come from a community in which gentrification is readily seen, and that's Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The downtown of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, if anybody knows, around the Marquette University area, that was in essence some of the more dangerous parts of Milwaukee for many reasons, but also where a lot of folks of color also happen to be. And now there's not any real folks of color down in the area, and that area has been heavily invested in, like the freeway that is kind of connecting Milwaukee to Chicago and to Green Bay. Actually, the artery that goes from Milwaukee to Green Bay, I-43, much like Rondo, cut through a predominantly Black and thriving community. And so while we see the housing part of gentrification, we also see sort of the infrastructure pieces that are bifurcating like thriving Black communities and thus causing more of the wealth gap. In particular, some of the properties that in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that may have been $20,000 in predominantly Black areas, and that was the value for 10 plus years and never grew. They kind of move Black folks out of that area. Condominiums go up, and some of those condominiums are, $1.2 million. I mean, it wasn't the land, right? It was the people who were there. And I think we saw that with the Jim Crow of the North, that it absolutely heavily depended on who was in that area. And so I think when we talk about gentrification and its role in exacerbating the wealth gap, it's real, but it's complicated as well, right? But I definitely believe that it's real. I think we see some of the more highly publicized cases, such as Harlem or Brooklyn, right, that used to be really Black and vibrant, and now some of the folks who grew up in those communities don't recognize it as they go back because it is becoming more predominantly white. And so I think, yeah, it's real. It absolutely is real.
And Bukata, you make the right point. It's real important because it comes back to that issue of housing. So here in South Central Minneapolis, if a Black family, maybe multi-generational Southsiders, can't afford a home in their neighborhood, they're renting in an exurb, they're not developing the equity, et cetera, et cetera. So you're absolutely right in that regard of home ownership. It is the key issue to look at.
And Bukata, here's a question for you specifically. Is there a red line project happening in Mankato?
If they're referring to, are we trying to partner with Mapping Prejudice to do a similar sort of uncovering of racial covenants here in Mankato? Yes, that project was in the works with COVID, not moving as of right now, but there was an opportunity. Again, Blue Earth County, City of Mankato, partnering Blue Earth County, sent some covenants to be in a sample amount of covenants to be looked through to look for racialized covenants. And then we were going to move forward with more, but with COVID, we haven't done that. But if they're referring to like a project now, like a housing project or something that's going up, I wouldn't know that if there was a project like that. But in terms of us trying to do the work that's been modeled by Jim Crow of the North and Mapping Prejudice, yes, we absolutely wanted to, and we're beginning to do that work.
So if somebody wants to volunteer for that project, what do you tell them? Do you tell them that once COVID's over, then we'll proceed?
So, one, I would say wear your mask, people, right? So that we can't come back and be in relationship as we have to do this Zoom thing now. But yes, our hope is that as we're able to kind of more fully re-engage in community, that we will restart the talks with Kirsten and Kevin to do that project here. And so I would say check back with the council in the coming months after we have beaten COVID, if you will, or have a more firm understanding of our going forward with COVID, and we'll be able to provide some sort of update.
Yeah.
I will add just quickly that the Mapping Prejudice team has moved across the river here in the Twin Cities to Ramsey County and St. Paul. And so if some of you all want to get some practice before you can kind of explore your own county's history, I believe if you go to the Mapping Prejudice site, they're up and running with deeds from Ramsey County and St. Paul, and kind of starting again that long process that's going to help us understand the capital city and, you know, answer what happened to Rondo. I think we all know if it was carved up by covenants surrounding them, isolating that neighborhood, red lines because there are diverse people there, that's where the freeway went. You know, like we've always known that. But again, now I think we'll have that, in addition to oral history, irrefutable evidence. I imagine that will be coming.
Okay, and here's a comment from one of the audience. Although I have not seen the deed for my house, I was told my home in Mankato, built in 1958. That's about the same time that our home here on Hilltop was built, had a racial covenant in the original deed. So
And if it did, it's still there. You know, the one thing that we learned from Kevin and the Mapping Prejudice team is that the deeds, the covenants, that contract didn't expire, unlike my sister-in-law's family's perception. They were a part of that plot and place. And then even today, they're still there. Physically, they're not enforceable, but and that's important too, in that we want to know that history. So so the idea of if it was planted, if the deed was, if that contract was placed, the covenant was placed into that contract, it's still a part of that parcel.
mhm. Okay, here's a good question. How can we begin to right the wrongs of covenants and redlining? What policies should we be advocating for at the local level or larger level, both local and larger levels? So Daniel, you want to go with that first?
Yeah, I mean, you know, just in what I'm seeing, and again, sometimes it's in conversations like these, you know, one is we all have to get comfortable with the idea of reparative solutions, and the variation of that word is reparations. And, you know, I think just normalizing that conversation that such harm has been done, and with the Mapping Prejudice work, and now with their recent work with some economists at the U of M, they're able to create actual kind of formulas of just how the inequity has been affected or has been impacted by the covenants, and the double-digit percentages and difference of wealth development for a covenanted home versus the same home, regardless of place and other things, lakes, that doesn't have a covenant. So that would have been one Black folks could have had, doesn't have the same value to the degree of 20 to 40%. So all that to say, repair and reinvestment, you know, that clearly has to be. And I love the line at the found footage that was fascinating in this film, and to see Reverend Carty from St. Paul, who I'd never heard speak. You know, I knew of him and knew his role in the community, but to hear him say, what's his line? It's going to be cold, hard cash. You know, it's, you know, trying to get at that idea of that's real, is the systemic racism has been so devastating that there has to be policy that leads to reinvestment. And, you know, what that looks like is a community by community kind of process and decision and conversation. But also just on a less direct kind of reparative front, there's a lot of urban planners and city hall departments who are understanding this history and really trying to address, you know, new developments with this in mind. And I think you're seeing that a lot in the suburbs and exurbs around the city, the cities here. But so I like the idea that at that level, on kind of a local, kind of a Richfield or a Mankato level, that urban planners and policymakers can have this in mind as they're laying out for future development. One thing too, I'll add real quick, Bukata, is just the Fair Housing Act is just that. It's like civil rights legislation, voting rights, which we've already seen eroded and attrited. It could go away just as easily. Well, it wasn't easy, right? It took decades. It could go away just as it was created. So when we think about policy, we should also think to buttress the existing policies, and that isn't something we should take for granted.
That's a great point. I was going to bring that up. Glad you brought it up too. I think as I think about our community of Greater Mankato, I think one, like what we do locally is, one, I think we have to acknowledge, and Daniel spoke to it, like the real harm, both kind of psychologically, physically, emotionally, and monetarily, that was done, right? By racialized covenants, by systems and structures that were meant to exclude. And I think about, there's a story in a book called The End of the American Era by Andrew Hacker. And in chapter 5 at the beginning, he talks about how, and he's talking about living in Harlem. And he says, we can go past this certain street and we would go into to this community all the time. But it was a one-way corridor that Black folks never really passed over into our neighborhood. We could go through their neighborhood as much as we wanted, but Black folks couldn't come to ours. And he's retelling the story. And I think my point in that is that I think we also have to acknowledge that, like, white America, as maybe not as individuals, but as a whole, was complicit in how the system and structures were working too. Right, that we understood, we were part of it. We might have not been direct in standing out. I think it was 5,000 or so, they said, stood out of, is it Mr. Lee's home? It's saying you got to get going. We may not have been part of that 5,000 out in front of his home, but if we sat and did nothing, right, we also didn't do anything to stop that from happening. And I think that's a really important conversation in smaller communities like ours, because we have some of our own things that we have to excavate, right, before we can move to these reparative situations, these restorative processes. And I think that's part of it. And then to the Fair Housing Act, I think to local policies around financing and investment. I think about the community block grants. Like when we talk about like this dollar investment, I think it has to be as intentional as the divestment was when racialized covenants were put into place. And then I think we have to be okay with this, and this kind of goes to Daniel's reparations. We were very, very good at centering race in these early days as we were creating systems, policies, structures that excluded folks. Like we centered race. Like I think one of the comments analysis was that 100% of those covenants, right, referenced African Americans. Like we centered race. We didn't run away from race, right? And I think in the same moment right now, we have to center race. And we have to be okay with that. We have to be uncomfortable with it as we are trying to undo some of those things that we know have been done. It's documented, it's data, it's not conjecture or assertions. It is absolutely what history has taught us. And I think that's part of what, on a local level, we begin those processes to really kind of understand how that played out here, and then what we do here locally. I think I can see an elected official on my screen. I think we also make sure that we work with elected officials to undo some of that, right? I think we have to be able to partner to say, hey, here is like how we can build our community going forward, reinvesting in those who have been divested in, and we can show you dollars and cents what that looks like. So I think that's what we can begin to do here locally. I think all of us on this call, after examining and learning the truth, the ugliness of this truth, then we have to engage in reconciliation, right? To move forward. And so I think we work together. We understand locally how we were impacted, and then we do the things to repair.
Okay. Next question. I am a part of 1,000+ disciples of Christ that want to be a part of the solution. What organizations would you recommend to get involved with? What can we do now to help? So Daniel and then Bukata.
Yeah, and I would love this. I think is a good point for some of you all, the conveners of this conversation, to talk about, some steps going forward. There's always the legacy organizations, the NAACP and Urban League, but I really love this idea of the work like Bukata's doing, these committees and coalitions. Human rights councils are kind of one of the less known and less heralded innovations that Minnesota was pretty good at, from Humphrey and mid-century on, that, have had an impact. And you see the legacy of that idea of even like a, small town or suburban human rights commission, really key. But yeah, I think it changes in different organizations where one can actually put in work and volunteer. We've seen a lot of volunteerism this summer, and that was great, certainly in my community. But yeah, what about in Blue Earth County, Bukata?
So I would say one thing we can do is to make sure that each and every single one of those disciples know what the real history was, right? I think many times we kind of rush to do these outwardly things in terms of volunteer or get involved. And like, we haven't done like this really personal work to understand like what happened and then the implications on me. So I think about, if we were to take a church example, like the idea of outreach, right? You typically have some folks who say, we're going to do outreach. You invite folks into the pews, the pew sitters, right? Don't know who these folks are. Those folks are usually gone within a month or two, and we're wondering why outreach didn't work. And part of it is we didn't fully, right, like explain, work with those sitting in pews so that they welcomed them in, right, when we brought in new folks. And I think it's the same thing here, that if we have a cadre of folks who we can call on, I think one is we have to educate those folks for like this is the importance of this work. It is not, and I want to repeat, it is not that we are going to go save some folks, right? It is not that. It is that I understand, like, this is the history that has led to this, and I want to play a part in undoing that, right? And I understand how, like, deeply connected I am. Either I've benefited or I've been allowed access, or maybe I'm one of those marginalized groups that have been impacted. But like that really, like, each of us understanding like that history. And then I think, yeah, we begin to look for local efforts. So I think around housing, Partners for Affordable Housing and some other folks, I know, and Habitat, like, they would love to have thousands of hands to build more homes, right? As this really tangible way in which we are saying, okay, we are trying to reinvest, we are trying to put some kind of counter measures in place to move our community forward. But again, I think it's important that our mindset going into that wouldn't be that I'm here to save folks, but like, and I forget the exact quote and I apologize, but that my salvation is tied in each other's salvation. And so that's why I'm working. I'm not working to go save someone else. So I think that's one of the things that you could do with a group of folks who are ready to work.
Okay, thanks for the answers to that. What is being done to increase home ownership for Blacks? Daniel, do you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I mean, just seeing what comes to mind. I mean, I mentioned earlier the redemptive work of the bank. And I had done a project a few years ago, and this was actually my introduction to better understanding of redlining with the Wells Fargo Foundation. And they were interested in foreclosure prevention. This was right after the Great Recession. And so, as they should, they were investing in a lot of organizations who were doing that work. And then they supported TPT in doing some storytelling around that. And what resulted was an interesting film, and I should send you a link, that was kind of about understanding financial systems for like new Americans, just the dissonance in, bank and American financial culture and Hmong culture, where in the hills of Laos, they bury silver. That's what they do. So the idea of handing over their money to someone else who takes it away, never to be seen, is dissonant. And so we created these stories and narratives to try and create some common ground. But to your question, I think, that's just one example of hopefully some innovative ways that those who, in part are accountable for these systems and inequities, but also who have the resource and who hold, who are the gatekeepers. And so we cannot kind of let up on the need to have the banking system be accountable. Realtors are an interesting part of this too. We've had many screenings where realtors, several African-American realtors as well, have talked about their role. It's not in my film. I wish, we need to tell that story as well, because these covenants began with the National Real Estate Association, as you saw in the film. So, I think that is the idea of home ownership in diverse communities is about investment in policy and fairness at a number of levels and with different systems. But for me, it really does have to begin, or at least have a lot of focus.
I can jump in here. Okay, so it looks like we lost Daniel for a second. I see some in here about a distinction to be made about home ownership and actual land owned by Black folks, and I think that's important too. I think some of the things we can do is there's programs that help Black folks kind of move forward, understanding credit and how credit is used with down payments. I think there's a whole lot of programs in which we have to invest dollars in. And then I think, and Daniel talked about realtors. I think we also have to engage realtors and other folks. I think if we are in Mankato or greater Mankato, we understand that there is a perception, and maybe we won't admit it here on the Zoom call, but there is a perception about a side of town you would want to live on. And a lot of that is reinforced as well by realtors who may say that, right? And I think that's an important piece too, is that we continue to look at all of the ways in which home ownership becomes possible. It becomes possible because we have someone who is showing us homes and knows realty and knows prices and knows the system. We have someone who is working in banking that can say, hey, we need to find a way to increase how we provide dollars and funds to Black folks who are looking to become homeowners. Maybe it's land and realty. Maybe it's programs that help folks who have been traditionally shut out of those systems. And because being shut out of those systems and education being impacted and maybe some sort of criminal justice issues that have been developed because of that, or mental health, whatever it may be, how do we provide folks those services to then be able to move forward on a path for home ownership, both financially? We know credit is important. We understand location is. We also understand, and I think it's important to speak to, that we also know that who your neighbors are is important as well. If one thing I really took away from this documentary was that, like, here is some folks who simply want to have a place of their own, and a community says no. Like, a community just says no. And I think that's important too, is that much like we have to do this community work, and if we were to use the example of the outreach in the church, we do have to work with folks here locally, so that we begin to like dismantle those stereotypes and myths and those narratives about Black homeowners and what they do and don't do, and where they should and shouldn't live. And I think that becomes important, but it's a long path. I don't think there's a panacea or a cure-all. I think it's a lot of measures, both through policy and legislation, banking and finance, and then sort of community work.
Okay, thanks for that. And here's one for you, Bukata. Does Bukata still go into schools with race awareness program? We appreciated those efforts some years back at Cleveland High School. So you're one of your fans, Bukata.
Yes, we do. So yes, we do. So that's a program. It's a couple of programs. One, the Promoting Respect workshops. We work with 9,000 students in our area, highlighting and working with students around difference, really central message of respect for all, regardless of differences. And then, yes, we also do some specific work on race within communities and within schools and students as well, trying to help students look and see race, I'll say in this way, differently than maybe most of us on this call look at and have been acculturated to see race. And so, yes, we are still doing that. In COVID, we are doing that in a virtual way, but it allows us to save travel time and still reach as many schools as possible too. So there's a little bit of a benefit there. But yes, we still do that work.
Okay, great, thanks. And I'm a little mindful of the time. We have about 5 minutes left, so maybe time for 1 or 2 questions, depending on how the time goes, because we'd like to give each of you 5 minutes for your takeaway for our session tonight. And the next question, this is one that is applicable to Mankato in particular. We live in an area considered to be agricultural and rural in nature. Is there any type of a rural influence in the development of racial inequities or discrimination? So Bukata, you want to?
That's a great question. I'll go back to a comment I referenced earlier around sundown towns. And the North had many sundown towns, right? So I think many times we think about ourselves as very and extremely different than the South. It really is just a different iteration. But yes, we had sundown towns. And then, this is some things I've been thinking about for a while too, and that is because we do see there were some racialized covenants in our community here in Mankato, in rural America. We also then know that there was these de facto things such as sundown towns that then limited Black folks and folks of color from being in those communities as well. And so I think, yes, absolutely, there are some racial narratives and overtones and behaviors that we in rural have to be willing to confront. And I would say, and this comes from Robin DiAngelo's work around white fragility, but she talks about whiteness being constructed as a response to anti-Blackness, is how she says it. And I think as we look around our rural communities, in particular here in the North, I think we have to ask ourselves the question, and that is, are rural communities agricultural here in the North predominantly white or solely white just because that's the way it is, or were there forces that began that sort of trajectory? Mm-hmm. And I think if we were to be honest with ourselves, there was forces that began that trajectory. Now we've inherited that as folks who are here now. In particular, if you think about simply us as Minnesotan and indigenous land dispossession, like we understand the land that we are on was not white, right? That the land that we are currently on is not white. And so this idea of rural parts of our country, first being indigenous, and in particular in the North, now being predominantly white, tells us that there were some things that happened that I think we have to address.
Hey, you all, I'm so sorry about that. My high schooler ran up and said, the Wi-Fi, so it wasn't just me and my computer. So sorry, but I'm back, at least for now, for our final few minutes. And I came in on an interesting part of the discussion that as the city kid, I'm curious about. So I'm not sure.
Did you hear the question, Daniel, the last question?
I didn't, but I heard a little bit of Bukata's response. Would you mind repeating it? I can maybe give a quick.
Yeah. We live in an area considered to be agricultural and rural in nature. Is there any type of a rural influence in the development of racial inequities or discrimination?
Yeah, you know, one piece of Minnesota history that is somewhat known as it's surfacing more now, thanks to the amazing scholarship of Chris Lehman up at St. Cloud State. But I've been aware when I produced North Star of this, some of the vestiges of the legacy of slaveholders in Minnesota. And the story that is a little more mainstream because of the super awesome Jane Grey Swisshelm, the crusading female editor from mid-central Minnesota, who had a running kind of brawl with a slaveholder who had relocated to Stearns County and was literally trying to kind of start plantations. And you know, just she was calling him out. He had thugs kind of destroy her press. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's a story many of us knew. But Chris Lehman's research is showing us how many counties, the University of Minnesota, many institutions are directly connected to and were supported by investment from slaveholders. So enslaved people generated wealth is invested into the founding of Minnesota and a lot of our counties and institutions. Chris Lehman is, and I'm forgetting the name of the book. You know, he'd done some great articles, and now there's a book that escapes me. But it does talk about that idea of greater Minnesota and that founding and things that likely show up then in towns and small communities that then would kind of maybe perpetuate some of that. And frankly, you know, we don't want to generalize, but we see some of that in Stearns County and in St. Cloud as there's still ongoing tensions and struggles and probably color lines. And, you know, some of that is in the roots of that community.
Mhm.
If I could, I just wanted to say quick, I know we're running on time. I think to Daniel's point, I think one of the things that we have to wrestle with is, so say they weren't created because of racial animus. There is clearly racial animus in rural parts of our state right now, right? Very, very clear. And so I think part of it is, even if it wasn't created that way, we are seeing kind of these vestiges of these anti, if you will, folks of color and these racial narratives that are clear and palpable within some of our rural areas that I think we have to address.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. Daniel and Bukata, I'd like to thank you personally for being here and your insights into Jim Crow of the North. I'd like to thank everybody who had asked questions. Sorry we could not get to all your questions, but we just don't have the time to do that. So it's Daniel and Bukata, think about the documentary and what's transpired tonight. And if you could spend 5 minutes each on the takeaway that you would have for us here. And when you're done, then Pastor Michelle will give some closing remarks. And Bukata, why don't we start with you?
I don't have a 5 minutes. I think I have two things I'll say. One, I talked about it earlier, and that was, and I get it from Brian Stevenson, but it's this idea of truth and reconciliation, and like speaking truth and its ugliness, its fullness, like engaging in that, and then having our actions based out of that truth, right? To reconcile and to repair. And I think that's where we're really at right now. I think this pivotal moment in which we're being asked to analyze systemic racism, to dismantle white supremacy as it's been within our country. I think this film, Jim Crow of the North, shows that Minnesota wasn't immune to that. Minnesota also was impacted by that. We know as Mankato, we've been impacted by that because of our relationship and history to the indigenous folks in this community. And so I think my takeaway would be, there was a mob of 5,000 folks who came out, and I believe it was Mr. Lee's house. I apologize if I didn't get that right, but to Mr. Lee's house to have him to move. And I think for me, it would be, would we have that group of folks who would then show up to fight for kind of the soul of our community? And that's what I would leave for folks on this call, and I would leave for our community, is that we really do have an opportunity to coalesce around this ideal of welcoming and inclusive, about repairing our communities, and then moving forward.
Thank you, Bukata. Daniel, your takeaway?
Yeah, I'd almost love to end on that because that's so dope. I mean, that really is powerful. You know, as you may know, the lynch mob, and it was just that because there was calls to lynch the Lee family, and they were that serious about that act. But Mr. Lee was protected, as I think we allude to, by kind of former other World War I veterans and postal workers. Some were Black, but many were not. And, I do like to, what does Mr. Rogers say, look for the helpers. I do like to see and to lift up that part of our history too. The kind of the John Browns and my new documentary on Minnesota women suffragists, the Julia B. Nelsons from Red Wing, who lived an intersectional kind of progressiveness where she started, some of you may know, she started a store in Red Wing with one of her former freedmen students, an African-American, and several came up and followed her to Southwest Minnesota. I mean, she was living it. And when, Susan B. Anthony wasn't always living it in terms of some of her rhetoric. So that idea of folks who do step up. And part of it is something that Bukata's kind of reminded us throughout this conversation tonight is recognizing privilege and understanding systemic racism, and becoming aware and reading and watching. And that's again why I really appreciate you all spending all this time with my film and with this history. I think Marvel Jackson, is kind of looking down on this, saying, that she now is heard and known. But then it's about action. And that's what Kirsten Delegard will remind us too, is yes, learn about the maps, go through my volunteer process of mapping with us, and then do something and act. And so that can happen in different ways, but it begins with awareness. And that's kind of my work and my role, I think, as a storyteller. But then it's in the hands of you all to do something with that understanding, that empathy, and act.
Bukata and Daniel, thank you very much for being here tonight with us to share your insights with us. That concludes the program, and I'll turn it over to Michelle for closing remarks.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, Bukata. And thank you all of you for engaging in this fascinating and uncomfortable time together. And I say uncomfortable in the best way. Tracy Warnberg-Lem filled out that quote, and I want to read it because I think this is pretty interesting. It's from Lila Watson. If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that's really what, that's why Centenary is trying to do this work. That's why we're engaged in this conversation. I imagine in some ways that's why all of us gathered on this call tonight, almost 100 of us at times for more than an hour, knowing that our liberation as humans is bound up with one another. And if we're going to heal from racism, if we're going to move forward with justice, then we have to sit in that uncomfortable place of the truth. And if we can sit there, then perhaps we can move forward into a different kind of world, world that we dream for our children and grandchildren. So thank you for your time, and may you be blessed with, not with peace, but with discomfort as we wrestle with the truth of what it means to be Minnesotan, what it means to be American. We're people from all over the country. And may we find practical, tangible ways to continue to come together as community. Whatever our country tells us, we can come together to be community and to create a better community than we have known. Have a good night. Thank you for being here.
You guys.